Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I am your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today we are back with Professor Shaul Magid. Shaul, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I'm almost going to start with the end just to paint the conceptual pictures for listeners as to why they should, be interested in the history that at least we'll start off by painting out. The largest current Hasidic group, some estimates, you can probably give a more precise number, between 100 and 200,000 Jews. This is, larger than Chabad, even though Chabad is obviously much more visible, is Satmar, the main Satmar Rebbe of the 20th century. I think the first Satmar Rebbe, Yoel Teitelbaum, was a ferocious anti-Zionist thinker that, really went to the extreme of actually eventually blaming the Holocaust on the Zionist movement. So I really wanted to, unpack all of that, the history, and then, we can sort of end off with sort of the meta questions of, how seriously should we take these ideas? But I really appreciate, you coming on.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So let's start there. I mean, for somebody who maybe has heard of Satmar before, but, really has no conception of the movement, where would you start?
Well, the Satmar movement is actually quite interesting because Hasidism begins in the latter decades of the 18th century and then really, in a certain sense, explodes and blossoms in Poland and the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the 19th century. But Satmar doesn't really begin as a Hasidic group until in some way almost after the Second World War. I mean, it really is in some sense a group that really forms in the United States around Yoel Teitelbaum, who we'll talk about in a moment, of Hungarian Holocaust survivors after he leaves Palestine or Israel, because he leaves before 48 and settles in Brooklyn. So he was, of course, the rabbi in Satu, which was a town in northwestern Hungary, in the Mamoros district of northwestern Hungary, and he was also a rabbi in Crowley and a number of other places. And he's originally from Sighet, but there was no Satmar Hasidic group in Europe during that time. He really functioned simply as the town rabbi, and he was very well known. And he was, of course, of Hasidic stock. The Teitelbaum family goes back to Moshe Teitelbaum of Uli, who was one of the early Hasidic masters, who in fact kind of founded Hasidism in Hungary. So it's really actually quite recent, and I think people don't realize how recent it is. It's one of the probably most recent Hasidic groups that exist.
Interesting. And just to paint out the conceptual picture, lest listeners be confused, there was still, before Satmar, fierce Orthodox opposition to Zionism. So maybe it's just interesting to go through a digression there because, Satmar now is probably the most visible anti-Zionist Orthodox group. But of course, if we were to roll back the, time machine to, the 1890s, but even, really through the World War II, your average Orthodox Jew on the street, you would have assumed that they were anti-Zionist. And so can you talk a little bit about that? And because I think that gets a little bit into at least some of Satmar's philosophic critique of the state of Israel. I mean, why, just in the most general sense, if we dropped into, Europe or an American, Orthodox Jewish community in the year 1910, we'll just pick a random year, why was your average Orthodox Jew against Zionism?
It is true. What you're saying is true, actually, and it's important to note. The Satmar Rebbe once said, kind of as half of a joke, that what I am writing about now in the 1950s and the 1960s, this is what everybody thought where I grew up. I'm just one of the only survivors of this. So yeah, ultra orthodoxy, as it wasn't really called that at the time, but what we might call kind of maximalist orthodoxy in Eastern Europe, Austria-Hungary, Poland, and Russia, Pale of Settlement, were opposed to Zionism for a variety of reasons. Number one, Zionism was a secular movement. It started as a secular movement. It was a nationalist movement that was adopting nationalist ideas from the European countries around it. There were, of course, precursors to it, like Yehuda Alkalai and a number of others, but those precursors, those 18th century people, were not really Zionists. They were just advocating for the resettlement of the land of Israel by Jews. They weren't advocating for a nation state. So I think if we understand Zionism as the establishment of a nation state in the land of Israel, then that's something that was really almost exclusively secular at that time. And it wasn't only the Hasidic community or the ultra-Orthodox community. Samson Raphael Hirsch, who actually dies in the 1880s, so he's really dying right. He's dying right. He dies right at the beginning. Was not and was opposed to it. Moses Mendelssohn, who obviously is not part of the ultra Orthodox world, and he lived long before Zionism was a thing. The very notion of a Jewish autonomous state in Palestine was something that he was opposed to. So most European Jews who really were what we would call today Orthodox, certainly in the early days of the Zionist movement from 1897, let's say until 1910, were really opposed to Zionism. It was at that time almost exclusively a secular movement. There were certain groups like Mizrahi, for example, that's the classic group of Orthodox Jews who joined the Zionist movement, but they were very, very much a minority in those early years.
Yeah, and obviously, if we're talking about non-religious Jewish anti-Zionism, which of course there was a ton of in the early 20th century, I mean, they had sort of other views of, wanting Judaism to be able to assimilate into host countries and, all of that. How much of the religious Zionism is sort of, because Exile at some point, maybe we can date it back to the, mystical school of Svat with Isaac Luria, maybe perhaps even before, but Exile began shifting within the, sort of traditional Jewish community from being a sad inflection point of history to almost this, wholly ontological category of, it's actually through the exile, as Isaac Luria teaches, that is the precursor to the Messiah, because you are spread around enough to collect these disparate sparks everywhere. So is that one of the main reasons where it was just this hesitancy to say, hey, we haven't finished our job in exile yet, so you're hastening the messianic process long before its time, and or how much was it just the discomfort of, hey, this Herzl guy and his ilk, they are, anti-religious, they are socialist, and so we're just sort of like, we don't really want to have any of what they're having.
That's a good question. To some degree, I think the focused on exile, which was really a kind of a given before Zionism, probably was to some extent a response to Zionism. That is to say that the idea of hastening the end, going back to the famous, pericope at the end of Tractate Ketubot, and now what the status of that is, whether that was just an agadic, midrashic, flourish, or there's some halacha value to that. We can talk about that. But Jews before the 19th century, well, we're not really writing that much about exile. I mean, the classic example of someone who did is the Maharal of Prague in Netzach Yisrael, who writes a lot about exile and writes a lot about, on the one hand, that exile is an unnatural state for the Jews, and as it's an unnatural state for any people, but also that it's a necessary state to be in until the advent of the Messiah. So the idea that the focus on exile only seems to come into view when there is some proposal to end the exile. And that's what, yeah. And that's when you see the pushback against the prohibition against doing that. But before there was a proposal to end the exile, Jews just lived in exile waiting for redemption.
No, of course, because the Zionist narrative, which we can probably discuss the historicity on the side, but at least what a Zionist I think now would tell you is exile was, Jews just simply never had a chance to do this. So a variety of confluence of historic factors. Plus, in their mind, of course, the early, anti-religious Zionists, they felt, bound by the shackles of the Talmud, to quote one, I don't even remember if it was a Zionist or a Haskalah thinker. And so once, that whole tradition is off, and once the sort of glorification of the exile that you see a little bit in the Talmud, but then, of course, in a lot of Kabbalistic texts, are like, well, who really cares about that, right? This are, old folk religions, but, now we are trying to reinvent ourselves as, modern, the new Jew, we don't really care for that. You had mentioned the Talmud in Ketubot, which, for Satmar ends up being sort of a foundational text. So can you just, for listeners that, I've never even heard of, a tractate Talmud Ketubot, can you just talk a little bit about what that text is?
Well, the text is a strange text. It goes off the context of it is talking about the land of Israel, but it goes off and basically creates this kind of homiletic midrashic flourish about a series of oaths taken between God and Israel at the destruction. And the basic premise is that the fate and destiny of Israel at this time is one of galut. It's like a brit shel galut. It's almost like a covenant of exile. And the covenant of exile is really surrounded by a series of oaths that God takes oaths to the Jews, and the Jews take oaths to God. And there are three of them, and then there are six of them. It doesn't really I think we don't really have to go into the details, but the basic assumption is God is saying to the Jews that if you don't, one of the things, I will make sure that you will not be destroyed in exile. I will make sure that the Gentile population will not persecute you too much, yoter midai. Not that there won't be persecution, because that's part of the exilic experience. And you have to take an oath to me that you will not ascend back to the land in mass before the proper time. So pushing the end, hastening the end. And this, if you look through rabbinic literature for almost a millennium, there's very little about this text. Nobody seemed to take it that seriously. People only started to take that seriously when the idea of Zionism, which was in a sense, on the face of it, saying we're not waiting for God to intervene to redeem us, we are going to take the initiative to redeem ourselves. Now, the religious Zionist world read into that a whole theological, program that was instituted by Abraham Isaac Cook and then others about why, in fact, the possibility of returning to the land was itself a divine intervention, so that the Jews were not abrogating the oath, but history itself was opening up a space that the Jews would be able to do that. And so, in an interesting way, as you mentioned earlier, the Satmar Rebbe does say, Rabbi Yochanan, I don't know if it's quite accurate to say that he blames the Holocaust on Zionism, but what he does say is that Zionism was an abrogation of that oath. And the abrogation of that oath then freed God to no longer abide by God's oath, which was not to allow the Gentiles to oppress the Jews too much. In a certain sense, the whole process, the exilic covenant, was broken. And it's not that it was the Zionists that caused the Holocaust, it's that for him, Zionism, in abrogating the oath, in a sense, lifted the shield, the divine shield that protected Jews from this catastrophe. Now, I bring this up because an interesting mirror image to this is Tzvi Yehuda Kook, Abraham Isaac Cook's son, who became the leader of the settler movement, in an essay that's included in his collection of essays, basically argues that the Holocaust was because the Jews didn't leave Europe after the Balfour Declaration. And he actually uses the language of nituach Elohi, which means divine surgery, that the Holocaust was an act of divine surgery where God cut out the European Jews from Europe because the Jews didn't leave on their own accord after 1917. So in a certain sense, the religious Zionist response and Teitelbaum's response are like mirror images of each other, right? That either Zionism was the cause of the Holocaust or the non-acceptance of Zionism was the cause of the Holocaust.
Yeah, of course. No, it is fascinating to compare. They really are, the more I think about it, almost, theologic mirror images. The other, what I thought you were going to say is that many contemporary religious Zionists just flip the understanding of the oaths. Well, they'll say, well, God broke the oath by, allowing the Holocaust. And so subsequently, we're no longer bound that oath. We should accept Zionism. I've seen that also.
And
It's interesting.
They do that too, yeah.
So my last podcast was with Professor Chaim Saiman, who wrote this fascinating book about halacha, the rabbinic idea of law. And one of, the things that he says, at least about the Talmud, is that it's impossible to really reduce the Talmud to a series of legal codes, because the Talmud, of course, oscillates between what we might consider, real law and, agadata, and also, all these different thought experiments. And so, I think that this debate does apply to this, these interesting oaths at the end of Ketubot. And I'm trying to formulate this question. Maybe this is an unfair question. But do you think the use of these oaths was almost, you know, the religious community or Satmar was against Zionism, and they were sort of combing through the text to try to figure out, okay, what is the strongest foundation in traditional Judaism to counter this, or was it the other way around? Do we think that they had all understood these texts and then they said, hey, guys, wait a minute, if we actually look in our tradition, we're not really allowed to do this? And sort of to add on to that, when I always tell people, because, and I'm curious if you agree with this framing, when I, teach about Zionism in the course of a, broad scope of Jewish history, I always say, Zionism is paradoxically, a movement of radical discontinuity and also a movement in some sense of radical continuity. And it sort of oscillates because ubiquitous throughout Jewish tradition is this sort of, wider understanding that the Jews were kicked out of Israel because of our own sins, and sort of the opposite of that is we only are going to come back when God is there. I mean, every holiday we say in Musaf, because of our sins we were exiled from our land. So how much of this, Satmar clutching on to this, these three oaths, how much of that is just representative of, their entire understanding of Jewish tradition versus how much is it, well, they needed to find an opposition to Zionism, and so this was, the best case.
It's a good question. I think it's probably a combination of a variety of things. Probably all of what you said exists in terms of, what comes first, the chicken or the egg. I think we have to also remember that for most Zionists, they didn't care less about any of this. I mean, they were not living in the textual tradition, so it didn't matter to them. They were basically, in a certain sense, rebelling against a certain kind of diasporic exilic Judaism that they were trying to create an alternative to the idea that the destiny and fate of the Jew, to be a covenantal Jew, is to remain in exile until God brings them out. So for a lot of the secular Zionists, Zionism was a rebellion against Judaism. It wasn't just a rebellion against exile. They wanted to be, as they said, kikol ha'amim. They wanted to be like all the other nations. When you can argue from the prophetic texts onward, the whole message is not to be like all the other nations. So I don't think that we, now that Zionism has become so normative, or conventional, that we understand how radical it really was, how secularly radical it really was against the tradition. Now, you're right, it then gets written back into the tradition, and we have, Rev Kook's theology and everything that comes in its wake that is trying to rewrite the entire history of Jewish existence into this notion of Zionism as a divine intervention that creates an opportunity for the Jews to resettle the land and for the preparation of the Messiah. But most of the Zionists didn't care about that. I mean, they were basically saying, we want to be a nation, we want to be a people, we want to be sovereign, in part because we want to be like the other nations, and in part because we feel like we're not safe in Europe as nation states began to form and the Jews were not adequately integrated into those nation states. So there's a whole political agenda, and then there's a theological agenda. And I think it depends upon who you're talking to, whether the theological agenda is created as a justification against the political agenda or in favor of political agenda. But I think in general, what comes first is the political, and the theological comes in its wake.
Okay, so we'll go back to Telebam in a minute, but I am reminded of this, because all throughout our tradition, we obviously haven't had the, the secular and the religious, but we have had this tension between what you might call the sort of ideal state of the Jewish people and, for lack of a better term, ancient realpolitik. You have this debate in the book of Samuel when the Israelites are looking around and saying, hey, we kind of want a king, we want to be like the other nations. And God essentially says, well, this is a rejection of me. But okay, essentially go do it anyway. Here are some limitations. And so, this debate really has been alive and well for at least, 25, 2600 years. in terms of, now talking about, the inception of Satmar, really, post World War II, paint some general biographic and theological data for just, understanding what Satmar, and how it became what it is today.
Right. So he's a fascinating figure, Yoel Teitelbaum. He was already considered to be, a kind of Eloi, somewhat of a genius, or a Torah genius when he was in Hungary. He was already quite well known, and he ends up, as most Hungarian Jews, they didn't leave Hungary until 1944, and after the Nazis invaded, because the assumption was that the King of Hungary was going to protect the Jews against Nazis, against Hitler, which he did for a certain period of time until he wasn't able to do it. So by the time that Hitler invades Hungary in 1944, it was very, very difficult to escape. He ended up escaping over the border into Romania, after which he was arrested and then sent to Bergen-Belsen, and he then became part of what became known as the Katzner Transport, which is a whole other story about a Hungarian Jewish lawyer who had basically convinced Hitler to save a certain number of Jews for money. There was this whole kind of back and forth. He basically bought Jews freedom, and there was a train transport, and Teitelbaum's name got put on that by some of his students, some of his disciples, and he was basically taken from Bergen-Belsen on a train over the border into Switzerland, where all the Jews that were on the Kassel transport were free. And interestingly enough, he was asked, as the others were, do you want to go to Palestine or do you want to go to America, once he was in Switzerland? And for him, the answer was simple. He wanted to go to Palestine. He certainly didn't want to go to America. So the idea that somehow the Satmar Rebbe or Satmar Hasidism or anti-Zionism doesn't hold the same value for the sanctity of the land of Israel that Zionists do is actually just incorrect. I think that he was against the Zionist project, but he was not against the idea of living in the land of Israel. And so a lot of people really have complained bitterly about the fact that it's the Zionist transport of Katzner that saved Teitelbaum, and yet Teitelbaum then becomes the great offers this biggest attack against Zionism. And it's true. I mean, he knew that he was saved by the Zionists. He never denied it. But again, I think it's important to note, it's very hard for us to comprehend what it was like in Hungary once Hitler invaded, because everything changed literally, and survivors tell the story too, like within days and weeks. I mean, things were unraveling so quickly. Everybody was just trying to get out as quickly as they can. Everybody was just trying to save their own life at that point. And, one can't blame a person for, agreeing to get on a train that's going to take them to Switzerland when not getting on that train meant certain death. So I think one has to take that with a little bit of a grain of salt. But, it is definitely an episode within the Satmar world that is certainly curious and interesting. So after he goes to Palestine, to Jerusalem, and he sets himself up in the ultra-Orthodox community in Mea Shearim, the Eda Haredi, and he runs for an election to be the head of the Eda, which is the ultra-Orthodox Rabbinical Institute, and he loses the election to a person named Rabbi Diskin, and he was very, very distraught about that. And he decided to travel to America to raise money for his small yeshiva in Jerusalem. And once he got to America, he was welcomed by many, many Hungarian refugees who had survived the war, who remembered him from Hungary. And over the course of a period of a few years, he started to recognize that maybe he had a better opportunity to rebuild his community in America than in Israel. So he decided to stay. But unlike the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who never went to the land of Israel, never went to Israel, the Satmar Rebbe went to Israel numerous times. He went to raise money. He went to give money. Oh, he never went to raise money. He went to give money. So the relationship between a Satmar and the land of Israel is very different than the relationship between Satmar and the state of Israel.
I think that's a very underrated underrated point, and that's obviously different than other people, other Jewish anti-Zionists who essentially try to full disconnect Judaism from a land. I mean, in some way, I don't know if I personally agree with what I'm about to say, but I think I can make a strong argument. Satmar, in fact, actually values the land of Israel more than Zionists, right? Because for them, it's so holy that something that is as banal and bureaucratic and, secular as Zionism, it's almost, dampening the holiness of this, land. And so I really think there is a strong
I mean,
argument.
I just want to make one other point. I think we have to recognize that the community of Ashkenazi Jews that were living in Palestine in the late 18th, 19th century that were called the Yishuv HaYashan, the Old Settlement Jews. These were Jews who had been living in Palestine for a century and were vehemently opposed to Zionism, and they were opposed to the Zionists when they came. So they basically had made their lives in Israel, and they were in the land of Israel. They were Ottoman subjects. They were living with the Arab population, and there was a fairly, I think, decent coexistence between the Arab population, which made up the large majority, and this small number of ultra-Orthodox Jews who later became very anti-Zionist, who were living in the land of Israel long before the Zionists arrived.
One of the things that you say at the end of one of your articles in Tablet is you try to, place Teitelbaum's theology within, you say, Antichrist theology. And just to sort of unpack what at least I think you meant is, at some point, the success of Zionism, both perhaps to save his own life and, and obviously the success of Zionism actually working and founding a state and, the majority of Jews, or at least, 50% of Jews living there, that the proof of that success was actually proof of the, ipso facto evil nature of Zionism. That, a lot of, Orthodox Jews, and, I believe this is still the case. I was, trying to do some research on this. Obviously, it's very obscure, but there has actually been some push, even in the Satmar community in the last couple of years, to not explicitly identify with Zionism, but become more on the spectrum, towards Zionists than perhaps they were 30, 40 years ago. But for Teitelbaum, this is all, this wider divine test. And the very fact that it seems to be working is the fact that, this is the sort of last test that the Jewish people have to overcome. I'm wondering if you can unpack that a little bit.
There's a very broad ideology in Christianity of the Antichrist, which really originates in the book of Daniel, and then in Sefer Zerubbabel with the Armilus, and it really emerges in Jewish texts. That before the Messiah comes, there will be a false Messiah who will come, who will look like the true Messiah and act like the true Messiah, and convince many people that he is the Messiah. And I'm using the gendered language because it is in the text always a he. And then it will turn out that he will be a kind of satanic figure that will bring about the wars of Gog and Magog, and then the true Messiah will come. So the idea, in a certain sense, within Christianity is you have these Antichrist figures. Martin Luther talks about it a lot. In many cases, in Luther's writings and a little after, like popes are considered to be antichrists. That the advent of the Messianic era, and this goes back to Daniel, that the advent of the Messianic era is that there has to be a final test. And that final test has to be passed, after which the Messiah will come. And Teitelbaum believed that Zionism was that final test. In other words, interestingly, Rev Kook and Teitelbaum were equally messianists. And they both agreed that Zionism played a central role in messianism. Teitelbaum believed that he was living in what he called Ikva de Mashiach, the footsteps of the Messiah, just as Kook believed that. Kook believed that Zionism was the divine intervention that the Jews, even though it was secular, had to embrace, after which it will transform itself into this, true messianic vision. And Teitelbaum believed that Zionism was that thing that needs to be resisted in order for the Messiah to come. So just as Teitelbaum and Tzvi Yehuda Kook are mirror images of each other on the Holocaust question, I think Abraham Isaac Kook and Teitelbaum are mirror images of each other on the question of, is Zionism the true messianic movement, or is Zionism the final movement that is the Antichrist that Jews have to resist in order for Messiah to come? So, in this sense, and I talk about this more in the book, according to Teitelbaum, Zionism is actually anti-messianic.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that makes complete sense. And, from the religious Zionist side, I mean, you do have this multi-hundred-year tradition, perhaps starting with, Shabtai Tzvi, maybe a little bit earlier of, the way to bring about the messianic process is to almost negate, the law or, go full antinomianism. And so from some perspective, Zionism with seeing the secular vehicle as the vehicle of redemption is, I don't know if they would explicitly make this connection. I'm sure Rabbi Kook is not, Rav Kook is not quoting Shabtai Tzvi, but implicitly it does seem like a lot of that ideology is seeping in there in all sorts of interesting ways.
I would go even further than you. I think that Cook's thinking is there is a messianic, there is a Sabbatean strain to it. And as witness to this, late in life, Gershom Shalom is sometime in the mid-70s, I think it was the mid-70s, gave a talk at I think Kehilat Yeshurun in Jerusalem, which is a synagogue in Jerusalem, and he basically said the settler movement is neo-Sabbatean. So I think that your inclinations or intuitions are actually accurate. There is a kind of antinomianism to the notion that the transgressor is fulfilling the law.
And there's even explicit. I mean, I remember one of the cases that I found I don't know why this struck me as much as it did, because it's, a very minor case in, this wider conversation of, settlerism, but I'm forgetting the year, maybe 8 or 9 years ago, some settler, students from the yeshiva were throwing rocks at, Arab cars somewhere in the West Bank. And they ran back to, the settlement, and, the IDF is now coming in to, find them and arrest them. And this is on Erev Shabbat, so the sun is setting. And there was the rabbi of the community gave a heter, right, an allowance to basically say, you are allowed to get in your car and drive on Shabbat out of the settlement in order to evade being captured. And I remember looking at this, and, this for me is the complete, circle of what you're talking about, of like, okay, well, this is the exact, this is by definition, antinomianism. Now, of course, I think Rav Kook would, be also equally as upset about that situation. I do want to bring one more person here. We're sort of creating almost this, diametric poles of, Rav Kook and Rav Teitelbaum. Probably the Hasidic movement that people are the most familiar with is Chabad, which seems to take somewhat of, I don't know if you would call it a middle position or maybe a third position. Maybe it's interesting to just go on a tangent because, your average non-Orthodox American Jew knows a lot more about Chabad than they do about either Satmar or religious Zionism. So what was the Rebbe thinking about all of this throughout the 20th century?
That is a great question. So let's step back. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe that everybody knows about is the seventh Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he's the seventh of a line. The sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was his father-in-law, and the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe were both vehement anti-Zionists. The Reb Shalom Dov Ber, known as the Rashab, the Rebbe Rashab, who was the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, and then the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, were opposed to the Zionist movement in a way that really equaled Teitelbaum. I mean, they were living in the same ideological anti-Zionist world that Teitelbaum was. So when we get to the seventh, it's a more complicated story. I'm of the view that there is no way I can imagine that if you asked the seventh Lubavitcher Rebbe, are you a Zionist, that he would say yes. I don't think it's really Zionism for him. I think he believed in the sanctity of the land of Israel. He believed that the state of Israel was a place of refuge that could be safe haven for Jews. I don't think he really placed any religious value on the state of Israel. He believed also that they was living in the Messianic era, but, maybe believing that he himself was the Messiah. But the process of Zionism for him, the unfolding of a Jewish state and the resettlement of the Jews in the land of Israel, was not messianic. In an article that he wrote in Kfar Chabad magazine in 1951, he basically says outright, the Messiah will come from America. You can find the actual quote of that letter in the book Social Vision by Philip Wexler and Eli Rubin. They have a whole chapter on America where you see that the Lubavitcher Rebbe felt like America was the last phase of the diaspora, and the Jews had to do the work that it had to do in America in order for the Messiah to come. So Israel does not play a central role in his messianic thinking.
Interesting. So taking a step back and, just to sort of, try to, capture a little bit of the underpinnings, there is a sort of meta question that I think you've addressed also. It struck me when I was asking my brother, which questions I should ask. I did, got some questions from people. This is what he texted me. So it must, be on people's mind.
Okay.
And the sort of meta question is, how much should we care? And, just to sort of, talk about that argument, one side could say, this is very interesting, and it's almost, the same way it might be interesting to, what is the theology of the rabbis of the Talmud, but that might have less relevance for our lives as Jews, that can sort of be one side, because there is some argument that might go, well, Zionism, happened, there is a state in 1948. So essentially all the people before Zionism who are writing against it, their views are historically interesting, but obviously there is a, at least in my mind, a philosophic difference between being against creating something and then being against that thing continuing to exist after it. And so, that argument goes, Satmar essentially has, even though in some way they place themselves as, hyper traditional, you have this Overton window of Jewish tradition, and, Satmar has placed themselves outside of that Overton window in a way that maybe, extremists on the right, one could argue that, I don't know, Meir Kahane also, stepped off the Overton window, and, his views are interesting. And I know you wrote an interesting book about him, but, that shouldn't be sort of a normative view taught. Or another side says, no, actually, Satmar is at least one of the dominant voices that has been around for the last 2,000 years, obviously not in this, current conception with the theology of the Holocaust. And, for Jews who are thinking about our textual tradition, our religious tradition, also our commitment to, a Jewish state, that Satmar actually has to, constantly be there as, a voice saying, hey, don't get so caught up in the sort of, what I might imagine, the idolatry in the secular state, and understand that there are actually these values that are greater than, the modern nation state with all of this. So I'm curious to sort of throw that question to you. How would you want modern Jews in 2025, maybe whom aren't even Orthodox, right? So maybe they don't even share the presupposition of, that, both Satmar and Rav Kook and the Lubavitcher Rebbe has, that the Talmud is, the word of God, how should they contextualize Satmar?
Right. With a graduate student of mine, Zev Michel, we're completing a book called The Jewish Anti-Zionist Idea, which is the kind of companion volume to Arthur Hertzberg's The Zionist Idea. It's a documentary history with over 300 pages of original documents of Jews before the state and after the state who resisted and opposed and contested the state for a variety of reasons. So I bring this up because it's really the marker of 1948 is very important, right? It's one thing to oppose the establishment of a Jewish state, first of all, before the Second World War, before the Holocaust, and it's another thing to oppose it after it already exists. And that's true, and we had to make those kinds of distinctions. I think the difference that might be good for your listeners to consider is that these religious thinkers are living in a certain kind of theological universe that many others don't live in. So if you're living in a purely practical, pragmatic universe, you could say, okay, there was a Holocaust, 6 million Jews were killed, the Jews need a place, they have as much right as any other group of people to have a nation state, and so Israel is a legitimate, it's a legitimate act in order to, for Jews to become normalized in some way. And that is an argument it's a strong argument. Whether ethno-states work or don't work, what do you do with the fact that there's a large non-Jewish population in a Jewish state? How are they integrated and not integrated? So those are all the nuts and bolts problems of working out statecraft. But for religious Zionists or for religious anti-Zionists, they're living in a different world in terms of seeing the historical reality of a nation state not like other states. The religious Zionist world and the anti-Zionist world do not see Israel as simply a state among other states. They see it as being a particular moment in history of a certain, you know, intervention whereby the messianic era, the end time, however you understand it, is in the process of unfolding. So I understand if you don't really accept those premises, the religious Zionist argument and the anti-religious and the anti-Zionist argument, it doesn't make any sense. So, you know, from that perspective, I totally understand it. I think one of the things that we ran into is that because Zionism has been so successful, because it has become so normative, because it has become almost a replacement for legitimate Judaism. What's missing is that there's a whole other part to the story that has been erased from 21st century Jewish history, which is if you would read Arthur Hertzberg's 1959 introduction to the Zionist idea, which a lot of people read in college or people that are interested in the subject, and it's a great introduction. It's a fantastic introduction. It's like, it stood the test of time. It was written like, 65 years ago. What you don't really get from that introduction is that, there were people that were actually against this. You would think that, Zionism came into the world, everybody was in favor of it, and it came to be. But that was not the story. There was another story. And what we want to do in the documentary history book, and what I wanted to do in the title-bound book, is really tell that other story, not because I necessarily agree with it, but I think that it is an important story to understand the wide plethora of Jewish history in the last 150 years. So I again, it's not to say that you believe that Rev Kook is right and Rev Teitelbaum is wrong, or you believe that they're both crazy and Jews just need a place to live and have a right to a homeland. But if you're interested in Jewish history, if you're interested in Jewish existence, if you're interested in Jewish life and Jewish thought and Jewish ideas, then you have to really, you have to excavate everything that is. And I think that Teitelbaum offers a very interesting intervention that is deeply rooted in sources, rabbinic sources, to make a case that this was a mistake. And you can agree with it or not agree with it, but it's certainly something that's worth knowing about.
Yeah, I think also people do themselves a disservice when, because there is this idea that Zionism is just, this, I don't even know how to explain it, this natural continuity of the Jewish people. And, it turns out the time was right. And, great, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and Balfour Declaration. And next thing you know, the natural train of Jewish history. And it almost does a disservice to, whether or not you're a fan of Zionism or not, just understanding the profundity of it and how big of an inception point. I mean, it's almost like trying to understand the Zohar or something without ever asking, okay, well, what was your average person believing for the last 200 years in Spain before the Zohar? I mean, you have a lot more appreciation for those movements, and you can see how, both theologically and, Jewishly radical they are from seeing that. There is one or two, clarifications that I wanted to smooth over. And then I did have one question about the current Satmar community. A lot of people mistakenly conflate Neturei Karta and Satmar. Neturei Karta, as far as I know, these, the main split happened, I believe over the PLO, but I'm curious if you can draw out that history. But, Neturei Karta are the people who you would often see at, anti-Israel rallies, and, they are holding up signs saying, from the river to the sea, and that is not Satmar. And so where do you draw the distinction? Is your average Satmar person, what might they have thought of the, say the campus encampments, to pick, an example that everybody knows about?
The Neturei Karta was an organization that was founded among old settlement Jews mostly. It was founded by a person named Amram Bloy, who comes obviously from Europe, but he was living in Palestine in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and a lot of the Neturei Karta people were actually from Lithuania, so they were Litvaks. They weren't really Hasidim. I mean, they dressed like Hasidim, but they weren't really Hasidim. And the Neturei Karta is really a political organization that was the embodiment of the kind of ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionism. They had a strong affinity with Satmar. And there was a break in the 60s, as you rightly say, as you know, people may know, in 1964, the PLO was founded. Ahmad Shukari was the original, president or chairman of the PLO. He was considered to be too moderate, and by 1966, Arafat takes over. And at a certain point, Neturei Karta started engaging in dialogue with Arafat and the PLO. And this is when Arafat and the PLO were much more of a terrorist organization than they became later on. They were in the 60s. And at that point, Teitelbaum basically said, I'm done. I'm anti-Zionist. I believe this is a horrible project. I believe this is anti-messianic, but you don't communicate with terrorists that want to kill you. And, it probably comes from his own experience of living through the Nazi period. But he decided at that point to break with Neturei Karta. So there is a Satmar community in Mea Shearim in Jerusalem. There's a much smaller Neturei Karta community, but there is an intermingling between them. So it's not that, when you see the Neturei Karta people wearing keffiyehs, and have signs River to the Sea, they might not be Satmar, but they might be Satmar, because I think there's still, even though Teitelbaum and Blois parted ways, there's still a bleeding in of one community to the other. Satmar tend to be less political activists than the Neturei Karta, but their ideologies are actually quite similar.
Interesting, because it does obviously get caught up. I was just doing some reading before this, and there's all sorts of interesting, a whole separate tangent that we don't have to get into. What is the overlap between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism? I don't necessarily want to go down that rabbit hole, but people always bring up Satmar in that conversation, and I always reflect of how regardless of whether or not one thinks anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, or sometimes generally almost never, it seems a little bit disingenuous to bring in Satmar as see, these are the most religious Jews. But I'm curious what you think about that general differentiation, because the other thing, and I tried to find the article, but I can't find this. And I think, the only thing I found, and this is going back to a 2018, that it says, head of Satmar Hasidic sect castigates followers for admiring Israel. This is the Times of Israel article. But, I have heard that at least since October 7th, again, no Satmar, is going to be caught dead with an Israeli flag, but, just because of everything that's been happening, that, you would imagine, just the same way secularism is, creeping into, religious communities, that Zionism, is probably luring many, young Satmar. So, we can kind of, speak to either of that. I mean, what is sort of the demographic shift, or is there within Satmar now? Because I'd imagine, if I'm a religious, if I'm, seeing the entire world through a theologic lens, which of course Satmar is, the idea that, Zionism is the Antichrist, right? That might work to a point, but, does the Antichrist really take, 75, 80 years, 90, right? It almost seems like that argument seems to have a timestamp. So I'm wondering, when you get to, the next generation of Satmar, and especially now that, everything is being, hyper politicized and it's entering American politics, I mean, is there a shift, or are you predicting a shift there?
I think there's a shift, and I think there are a number of reasons, and I think it goes back before October 7th. I think the Satmar Rebbe of Yoel Teitelbaum, I think he really understood this was probably inevitable. Over the course of time, you have now Satmar Hasidim that are living in Israel, that were born in Israel, whose parents were born in Israel. Maybe their grandparents came from Europe. Maybe their great-grandparents came from Europe. So, they've been acclimated into Israeli society. They can't help but be acclimated into Israeli society, because just like they can't help be acclimated into American society in some way. So, for example, if you walk through the streets of Mea Shearim now, as opposed to the 1980s when I lived there, you hear much more Hebrew than Yiddish, as opposed to the 1980s when it was much more Yiddish than Hebrew. In other words, they're becoming Hebraized, they're becoming part of the country, they're taking part in the goods and services of the country. They're not serving in the army, but they're working in the society. So in a certain sense, they're going to become more tacitly sympathetic to the country that they're living in. And among the Satmar Hasidim that are living in Williamsburg, they have parents, they have children, they have cousins in Israel, they go to visit. In other words, over the course of time, there is going to be a kind of normalization. Even though the ideological opposition remains, there's going to be a kind of normalization of that community toward the project, which is the state of Israel. They'll never be Zionists. They'll never hang an Israeli flag. They'll always consider themselves anti-Zionists. But yet you can see that there's a slow, almost like a slow assimilation into world. And it's really, there's really no other way. I mean, unless they decide to go live in some, far-flung place. If you're living in a city, if you're living in Jerusalem and you're living in Mea Shearim and the buses are going by and you have to go to Misrad Pnim, or you have to go to Misrad Chutz, you have to go to Kupat Cholim, you have to go to the doctor, whatever, you just become part of the country. And I think that's what's happening. And the second thing is, there's a certain kind of, I think, adolescent rebelliousness that happens in every segment of society. And in that Satmar world, the rebelliousness often takes the form of being sympathetic to Zionism. I mean, that's their rebelliousness against their upbringing, right? Which adolescents will often do. So you can see that this is slowly happening. I will say, though, interestingly, and we found this in the November 2023 election, the election that brought this coalition into power, that the ultra-Orthodox Jews who have decided to vote, have decided to become politicized, are much more inclined to vote for far right-wing parties. So that you have young Haredi, ultra-Orthodox people in Bnei Brak that were voting for Ben Gvir in larger numbers than you would think. And I think in a certain sense, the settler movement saw that as an opportunity to widen its base, especially with young ultra-Orthodox Jews. Not necessarily Satmar, but of other types whose parents consider themselves anti-Zionists and the children are voting for Ben Gvir. That's not such an unusual phenomenon.
Yeah, and this is maybe the trend of what you might call a chardal, Haredi Dati Leumi, and I'm sure a lot of them wouldn't identify as the Dati Leumi, but that is interesting. Just you mentioned religious Zionism because it seems if the crisis for religious anti-Zionism now is the success of the state. I imagine the trouble for religious Zionism is that, just like the Antichrist, what does it take 80 years? Also, does the Messiah take 80 years? I mean, I think for the religious Zionist community, there also is this idea where, maybe if you were to ask a religious Zionist in, 1948 or, especially 1967 or 1968, when is, Mashiach going to come? They would say, any minute now. And then, of course, the religious Zionist movement, I don't know how much Oslo, is a part of this. Certainly the, the disengagement from Gaza in 2005, for the religious Zionist camp of, seeing this sort of, what was originally this untempered march through, messianism through the state, all of a sudden now, it's hit a lot of patches. So, theologically, what is happening right now in the religious Zionist community? Because it seems like Ben Gvir, I mean, in as much as he's a representative of at least, let's say the right half of the religious Zionist community, I mean, is there actually a theology at play there, or is this just, hard right nationalist politics?
Yeah, that's a different conversation. I'm actually writing something about that now, about whether October 7th was really the kind of inverted finale of 1967, of June 1967. That June 1967 introduced a new paradigm, and that paradigm became religious Zionism as we know it today, right? Which is greater Israel, maximal, a maximal land possession, a belief in this messianic process that was unfolding, that had certain kind of hills and valleys. On the one hand, you have the Six-Day War, obviously, which kind of accelerated this idea that the end time was coming. Then you have the election of Begin in 1977 and the right-wing coalition. Then you have a setback with Oslo. Then you have another setback with the assassination of Rabin, another setback with Baruch Goldstein, and in a certain but it keeps moving, right? There's a setback and it keeps moving. And in some way, I think that October 7th was this, inverted finale, meaning that's over. The idea that we can manage the occupation has proven to be false. And that was basically what Sinwar was able to do. He was able to prove, no, you cannot manage the occupation because eventually we will get you. And I think that the response to that has been desperation. And that's what and so the response to 67 was this idea of strength, right? We thought we were going to be defeated, we won, we're strong, we're a major player in the region now, we have leverage. And I think that October 7th, what October 7th and Israel's response to October 7th, in what's going on in Gaza now, is actually a sign of weakness. Because vengeance is a sign of weakness. And I think that the paradigm of 67, which was the origin point of religious Zionism, has ended. Now, where that's going to lead, I don't know. Right now, it's just leading to kind of death and destruction. But I think the very idea that this is a messianic moment that we just have to wait out, I think that in some way, what ended up happening is that you have this kind of natural messianism, like 67, Six-Day War, miracle, God's intervention, the Kotel, everything, this natural process is happening. And then I think what October 7th did was arrested that process. So now the messianic process is moving into an apocalyptic mode, which is what we're seeing in Gaza, which is like, we're just going to basically flatten everything. We're going to destroy everything. And I think it's a very dangerous time.
I'm excited to read that article. I love talking to you because I always, end with, a whole stack of, articles and books that I then have to read.
We're in it's interesting to talk about this now because we can talk about theoretically theology and, we're in a very, very dangerous moment, not only in terms of the physical danger to Jews, to people in Gaza. I think we're talking about a moment of really, in some sense, how, what kind of Zionism will survive. It's not that the Zionism won't survive. What will it look like? What kind of Zionism will survive? And it's not at all clear what that will be. The settlers have succeeded in taking over the country, basically. That's what we saw in November 2023. And it's now, May 2025. So we're talking about, it wasn't a short-lived coalition. And it's not really clear how Jews, myself included, certainly, and Israelis, how you step back from that precipice. And I think that we're in a state of, as I see it, extreme weakness and defensiveness, which is the inversion of 67. After 67, like, I'm not talking about the Arab world, but like the West, right? Everybody loved us. Israel was the, the little engine that could, right? I mean, we were the kind of miracle story of Western civilization, and that's not true anymore. And now we're the Goliath. And so it's not really clear where we're going. I mean, it's very funny because I think what we in the modern, postmodern world, what we really lack is patience. So people will say, oh, you read these apocalyptic texts from like the first century of the Common Era and, how the world's going to end and everything is going to end. And, well, didn't they realize that they were wrong? And the answer to that is no, they thought they were right. They just said the end takes a long time. Like thousands of years. So we're living in that apocalypse that began for them in, I don't know, the first century before the Common Era. But in America or in the West or in the world now, we want things right away. Like, what do you mean? It's not happening now? What do you mean? It's not happening next year? It must not be true. It's a slow train.
Yeah, no, I think that's really fascinating. I know we've been talking for a long time. Is there anything else, either on this, last bit or just, general Satmar, religious anti-Zionism that we haven't touched?
I just think that, a lot of people will be probably offended or upset with this book I'm coming out with both of these books, the documentary history and the book on Satmar. But I really think, I'm a person who has dedicated my life to Jewish ideas. That's what interests me. that's what keeps me up at night. That's what drives me. And I think that you might not agree with him and I'm bringing this out into English for the first time. You might not agree with him, but it's interesting to take him seriously as an ideational project in terms of what it meant to be a Jew in the early 20th century, what it means to be a Jew in the early 21st century. This whole story of Zionism, Israel, anti-Zionism, student protests it's just the natural process of human civilization trying to figure itself out. And for whatever reason, we are, as Jews, in the center of it. And we might not always be in the center of it, and we weren't always in the center of it, but right now we're in the center of it. And I think it's really worth it to draw from as much of the tradition and people who thought deeply about this as we can.
I think that's really powerful.
Yep.
Shaul Magid, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Daniel.